Do you need to upgrade your Pylontech batteries or debug a battery problem? In this video, I'll go over everything needed to flash a new firmware and download the battery logs. So I recently installed 8 US3000C Pylontech batteries and almost immediately ran into a serious problem, an internal battery alarm on one of the batteries. This seemed to be caused by an over voltage error on the battery. Sometimes the error would happen twice a day, sometimes I could go a week without the error and then it would recur. Using the BatteryView application, I was able to connect to the battery and download the logs. I emailed these to Pylontech, who got back to me very quickly, confirming that a firmware update should resolve the problem. That was great because I had feared I was going to have to package up the battery and send it back to Pylontech. I'm going to walk you through step by step what I did to flash a new firmware. And at the end of the video, I'll also include a little demo of how to download the battery logs if you're having a similar internal error in your batteries and you need to send them off to Pylontech. So I think it's important that we start with a disclaimer. Updating the firmware on your Pylontech batteries should only be done to resolve a specific problem. It's not like your phone where you might want to flash a new OS every now and again just to see if there are any new bells and whistles. If nothing's broken, don't mess with it. I'm doing this to resolve a specific problem. Also, this is what I did. I'm not an expert, and you do this 100% at your own risk. Strongly suggest if you have any doubt and you don't know what you're doing, don't do it. I would only continue watching this video if you're willing to take 100% of the responsibility and accept that you might well brick your battery or void your warranty, and that will be entirely your fault. Don't blame me. So I'm going to split this up into 4 sections. We will need to make or acquire a USB to serial cable to connect to the console port so that we can communicate between our computer and the battery. We'll need to get the BatteryView application and firmware to install. We'll need to connect to the battery, and then the last step is to flash the firmware. The hardest part of this whole process is getting a cable to connect your computer to the batteries. It doesn't seem like you can get these easily. I have heard that you can purchase them on eBay for lots of money. I think I heard 50 or 60 pounds. But when I looked, I couldn't find any available. So I've gone down the route of making my own cable. It's not that hard, but it's also not simple. So connecting your computer to the batteries requires a USB to RS232 serial cable. The serial cable needs to have an RJ45 connector on the end with the correct pin out. This is where the problem starts. You can go on Amazon and you can buy a USB to serial cable with an RJ45 connector on the end. These are usually designed for connecting to routers and switches, often Cisco switches. But the pin out on the RJ45 connector in these does not work with Pylontech batteries. So I will link below to the specific cable that I purchased, but there are lots of different cables available on Amazon that should do the same thing. Some of them use different chips. The cable I purchased uses an FDTI chip, which was a bit of a pain because when I connected it to my Windows 10 machine, it wouldn't find it, and I had to go off and find the drivers, download and install the drivers before it would appear as a COM port on my Windows machine. So once you've got yourself your USB to RJ45 cable, we need to fix the pin out on this RJ45 connection, because as I said, it will not work with the Pylontech batteries. So first thing we're going to do, take the RJ45 and remove it. Then we need to strip back some of the insulation and expose the individual wires. Now, the Pylontech batteries only require the RX, the TX and the ground lines. All the rest of these are redundant. For this particular cable, and most cables that are designed for connecting to Cisco switches, for example, we want the third cable is the RX, the fourth and the fifth cables are the ground lines, and The sixth cable is the TX line. The rest are redundant and we don't need them, and the simplest way I've found is just to cut off the ones that we don't need. Makes connecting it up to a new RJ45 connector much simpler, less problems, less cables to worry about, especially when they come with these flat cables. It's quite hard to twist the cables over and to get them into the RJ45 port. So I'll put up on screen now which cables need to go into which pins on a new RJ45. So the only problem with the pin out on the previous RJ45 were the ground lines. So those were cables 4 and 5. The Pylontech batteries expect a ground to be on pin 8. So we need to wire this back up into an RJ45 with either the cable that was in pin 4 or 5 in pin 8. The RX and the TX should be in pin 3 and 6 respectively. So let's do that. So in this particular cable, I'm going to take the first 2 wires. We don't need those, let's get rid of them. I'm also going to take the last 2 wires. We don't need those. In this case, that's brown and purple. The other 2 were blue and green. So we'll get rid of those as well. And I'm going to pick one of the ground lines. In this case, I'm going to take the black one. So let's get rid of the red one. We don't need that. So now I am left with pin 3 is yellow, pin 5 is my ground, is black, and my TX, in this case, is pin 6, is orange. Now I'm going to get myself a new RJ45 connector, and we need to, first of all, let's measure up and cut these cables so they're an appropriate length. In fact, before we do that, let's take 8 and move it over a bit so that it's on the correct side of the socket where it's going to go. Because it has to go into pin 8, remember. Then we will line this up. Looks about right. Take a little bit more off. So the trickiest bit of this is trying to get these into the correct pins. So when you look at your RJ45, the flat side, looking directly at it, the left is pin 1 and the right is pin 8. So in this case, I want to put my yellow cable into socket 3. I usually start with pin 8. So we'll go pin 8 for the black cable. We'll leave one space. That looks right. If you look directly on the end, you can double check that the cables are in the correct sockets. So starting from the left, we go blank, blank, yep, then we've got yellow, blank, blank, orange, then blank, and then black. So that looks good. So the final step to completing our cable is to crimp the RJ45 on. So very carefully, make sure that the cables don't slip out. This is a really crappy crimper. Just double check the ends, make sure everything's in there. Crimp that down. So, job done. Don't know if you'll be able to see that on there. Cable is completed. We can now proceed to installing the drivers and checking that the cable works. So the next step is to download the BatteryView application and install it on your computer. I would strongly suggest you only install software that's given to you directly by Pylontech. That includes BatteryView and the firmware. Downloading it from the internet, from a forum for example, you never really know what you're getting. And if you insist on that, a Google search will probably find you what you're looking for. So another caveat to bear in mind at this stage, there are quite a lot of posts online with people complaining about their bricked batteries. What seems to have happened here is Pylontech have changed the BMS, the chipset on the BMS inside the US2000C and US3000C batteries. So there are now two different hardware divisions of these batteries with completely different chipsets. These chipsets require completely different firmwares. The way Pylontech have ensured that nobody is going to brick their batteries is by having a BatteryView application that takes a zip file instead of a bin file and will automatically look at the serial number and choose the correct firmware to flash. Lots of people seem to be grabbing bin files and flashing those in BatteryView and ending up with bricked batteries because they've flashed the bin file, the firmware, for the wrong battery onto their battery, and you end up with a paperweight. I think it's recoverable. I've never had to do it, wouldn't want to have to do it. The point of this is to ensure you use BatteryView version 3.028 at the minimum and only ever flash a zip file containing both firmware versions, and the BatteryView application will take care of ensuring that the correct firmware is flashed to your battery. So it's a good idea at this stage to check in Device Manager to identify which COM port your USB to serial cable is connected on. So in Windows, you would use the window key and type device, open up Device Manager and navigate to ports. So if you open up ports, you can see here I have two existing standard serial over Bluetooth links. One is COM6 and one is COM7. At this stage, I'm going to plug in the USB cable into my laptop. Helps if I put it the right way around. Give it a second, see the screen refreshes, and I now have a USB serial port on COM3. So when I open the BatteryView application, I know it's COM3 that I need to select. If I select either of the other two, it's not going to connect to my battery, and I'm going to get a timeout. So now we can proceed to connecting the RJ45 cable into the battery that we're interested in. If you're only going to be downloading the logs, or you just want to connect BatteryView to look at the status of the battery, you can leave the battery connected to all your other batteries with the link ports. If you're going to be flashing a firmware, I would strongly suggest that you shut down your whole system, switch off all of your batteries, disconnect the link ports from each battery so the batteries are individually sitting by themselves, and then connect the console port into the battery that you're interested in one by one as you update the firmware. That way there's no confusion, there's less things to go wrong. It just makes a lot of sense. You don't want anything to go wrong while updating the firmware. It's high risk enough as it is. So take our RJ45. In this case, I'm going to plug it into my battery number 8, and it goes into the console port. You can then open up the BatteryView application. So I have it on my desktop here. You can go into Pylontech firmware, BatteryView, double click on BatteryView application. So when the BatteryView application opens, this is the screen that you'll be welcomed with. There's very little information available here at the moment. For connecting the battery, what you're interested in is the very bottom left here where it says ready. And to connect to the battery, we, strangely enough, go to connect. So here, the port that's been selected is COM port 6. We've already looked in Device Manager and I need COM port 3, so I'm going to change that to COM port 3. You can leave everything else as it is. And we click OK. You see down in the bottom left now it says connecting, and then initializing, and we are now connected to the battery. So there's still not a lot of information available here. In the bottom left panel, we can see some information about the battery, including the model, the firmware version, the barcode. So in this case, it's barcode ending 962. It's a good idea, just double check your battery and go 962. So we know it's definitely the correct battery. I believe the BatteryView application can show you all of the batteries. I think if you connect it to the master battery, it can show you the status of all of the batteries that are linked together. Again, if you're doing a firmware update, you should only be connected to one specific battery, the one that you want to flash the firmware to. To see some more information in here, we can click Start Scan. So that will do a scan of the battery. If you leave it a second or two, we now get all of the different cell voltages and lots of different information about temperatures, the battery voltage, the current. So when you click Connect to connect your battery, if you get, instead of getting initializing in the bottom left, you get a timeout or some sort of dialog with an error message. The timeout usually means that there's something wrong with your cable or you've selected the wrong COM port. So double check you've got the correct COM port, and if that doesn't work, go back and check that the pinout on your cable is correct. So to flash the firmware, we go to Options, Update, then we get the Update dialog. The first thing we need to do is browse and select the zip file that we want to flash from. So in this case, I've left that in the Pylontech firmware folder on my desktop, and we are flashing version 1.7 for this battery. But you can see here that contains version 2.8 and 1.7. So those are the two different versions that you need for the two different chipsets. The next step is to click Program, and up will pop some diagnostic information. So the current version is 1.4, and the flashing process will begin. So this takes about 2 minutes to run through. I'll fast forward it because it's boring. So now that the update has completed and the firmware has been flashed, you can see in the log that we went from the current version 1.4 and the new version is 1.7. So the firmware has now been flashed and the battery update is completed. You can then close the update dialog. You can confirm in the left that we have version 1.7 on the battery, and if required, you can now disconnect from that battery, take your cable out, connect to another battery, and repeat the process. It's always a good idea if you have a stack of batteries like these to ensure that they are all running the same firmware version. So although I only had a problem with one of my batteries, I did flash all of the batteries to be version 1.7. Earlier in the video, I promised that I would also show you how to download the battery logs. If you're having a problem with your battery and you need to get in touch with Pylontech, it's ideal if you can do this beforehand and send them everything that they'll need to diagnose the problem and give you the best possible advice. So just like when we were updating the firmware, once again, we are going to go into the BatteryView application. We'll launch BatteryView, go connect, obviously with the cable connected to the battery that's throwing the error that we're interested in. We will select COM port 3 again, connect, connecting, initializing. We're connected, and we're going to start a scan. I don't think this is really necessary. So to get the log files, we go up to Options, not Options, Window, and we go to History Data Window. So click on that, and you will get a new window opens here. So there are two different logs that you can get, an event log and a history log. I sent Pylontech both. I don't know if they need both, but it's the same process to get both of them. In the top left here, you can click on History. which will open up a download window. So pick a suitable location to download the logs to and click save. You'll then see at the bottom of this window it says 0% system is acquiring cycle data. So the history can be quite slow. I'll speed this bit up. So now that that has completed, we should have a file with the history of the battery. That's a normal text file that you can open up and read yourself if you want. To get the event log, it's exactly the same process, but a bit faster. So instead of clicking history, you click on event, and again select a suitable location and click save. So in this case I've got a out of range system is acquiring event data. I think it has completed. Probably there are no events to log on this battery, but that will create a separate text file that you can open up. It's much shorter and it has interesting events, errors, internal errors, those sort of things. So if you email both of those off to Pylontech, hopefully they will be able to get back to you quickly and let you know the best way to resolve your problem. Hopefully you found this video helpful. I've got lots more videos coming up covering my Pylontech and Victron system. If you like this video, please like. I'd really appreciate a subscribe, and if you don't want to miss my upcoming videos, mash the bell button. Catch you next time.